Larry Coryell was one of the greatest guitarists of the latter part of the 20th century. A virtuoso jazz guitarist, he was also adept at country music, rock and roll, and rock music. He emerged in the early 60s in the US of A and came up at the same time as guitarists like Pat Martino and George Benson. He was in that league as a player, but Larry was so much more than that. He was an adventurous spirit and a highly experimental and innovative musician. And by the mid-60s, he was one of the first musicians in the world to be bringing together the world of rock and jazz. It could be said that Larry Coryell was the godfather of jazz rock fusion. An incredible player, charismatic, wild, crazy, one of my favourite players. If you were to put him up against guitarists at the same period on the rock scene, like Hendrix or Clapton or Jimmy Page, Ritchie Blackmore, Larry Coryell is head and shoulders above them in terms of playing ability. So as I start this video, which is going to be a biography of Larry Coryell, the first question that we should ask is, why is he not known? Why don't we mention him in the same breath as, say, a John McLaughlin or an Alan Holdsworth even, or a Matt Metheny or a John Scofield? It's quite interesting that he's not the sort of go-to guitarist when we start mentioning jazz rock fusion guitar players. And I think that's very unfair. Hopefully, by going through this biography of his life and looking at some of his key recordings, and of course I will be throwing in my own personal views, whether they're right or wrong, but I will give my own interpretation of what happened during his life and what he achieved and what he didn't. And hopefully at the end of this video we might be able to elucidate why Larry Coryell's not a household name in the world of guitar. Larry Coryell was not born Larry Coryell. He was actually born Lorenz Albert van der Linde III on April the 2nd, 1943. He was born in Galveston, Texas. Quite an interesting place musically in the 1940s, being the nexus of country music and other folk forms. He never knew his biological father, who was apparently a musician. Instead, he saw his stepfather as his father. His mother, whose name was Cora, encouraged him to learn piano, which he started in his early years. In his early teens, he switched from piano to guitar. His guitar teacher introduced him to such players as Les Paul, Johnny Smith, Barney Kessel, Tal Farlow. The usual clutch of 1950s jazz guitarists that were very popular at that time. As with many guitarists in this period, the great influence was Wes Montgomery. Larry Coryell also listened to guitarists like Kenny Burrell. And that more funkier style, that more gutsier style, actually went into his playing. In 1965, at the age of 22, Larry moved up to New York, enrolled in music college, and started to listen to various modern classical composers. Stravinsky, Ravel, Bartok, all started to influence him and influence his approach to guitar. Of course, being in New York at this time, meant that he was right in the middle of the burgeoning rock scene that was just emerging at that time. If we think about what Larry was getting exposed to, obviously bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, but he was also listening to the newer, more psychedelic bands that were coming out. Frank Zappa, Velvet Underground must have all been an influence. The Doors, Love, all those sorts of American psychedelic bands was having an effect on Larry's playing. Now, Chico Hamilton, the great 1950s cool jazz drummer, West Coast jazz drummer, in the 1960s started to move towards a much gutsier sound and brought in the electric guitar of Gabor Szabo, who was a great influence not only on Larry but also on Carlos Santana. Gabor is another guitarist. It was very popular at the time, but he's now not remembered that well. Gabor made some incredible records with the Chico Hamilton group in the 1960s, then left and Larry was brought in, contributing to a number of albums at that time, most famously The Dealer, which I believe really is the beginning of jazz rock fusion. And why is it? It's because of Larry's guitar playing. He's jazz trained, but he's not playing jazz guitar. The breadth of the chords and the chording, chord progressions, and then the playing and the phrasing, he's pulling from a whole bunch of guitarists, especially people like Eric Clapton and Jimi Hendrix. In 1967, Larry saw very early on Jimi Hendrix, and this must have been very impressive to him. He starts to pursue that power trio sound. His work with Gary Burton at this time is essential for the development of jazz rock. He also forms a band called the Free Spirits, which has been seen as being the first, custom-made jazz rock group to be formed. Larry is at the centre of every development that is happening in the 1960s at that time, and he's the go-to guitar player. He's playing on the album Duster by Gary Burton. Again, is another step forward. In 1969, another guitarist that was pursuing similar ideas, John McLaughlin, arrived in New York. He'd been invited there by Tony Williams to join the Tony Williams Lifetime. Now, Larry Coryell, of course, was the other guitarist that had been considered for that role. But Larry seemed to be in awe of John McLaughlin on seeing him at this point and championed him, getting him to play on perhaps Larry's most famous album, Spaces, which brought not only John McLaughlin into the mix, but also Billy Cobham, a very influential album and a very important album that emerged in 1970. His first solo albums are a hodgepodge of a sort of post-Coltrane, Jimi Hendrix electric guitar, sort of wild improvisations, which is fantastic, and also Larry's attempts at writing pop songs and singing. They're a mixed bag, and although the experimentation and innovation is very interesting at this point, he doesn't make the masterpiece. In fact, I think jazz rock needed Miles Davis to step in, bring John McLaughlin in, and then with Tony Williams' Lifetime, and then finally the Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin makes the great statement. Larry's there, and he just doesn't quite play on that album. He doesn't make that album that introduces the style. Throughout the 1960s, he's a leader in this. By the end of the 1960s, early 70s, he's a bit of a follower. Now, we often wonder whether the excesses of the 1960s were starting to take their toll on Larry. As his story emerges, we'll find that Larry actually had real problems with drug and alcohol abuse. And I feel that with all the maelstrom and incredible creativity he was involved in the late 60s, maybe some of the other aspects of that scene were actually stopping him from being focused. What's very interesting with John McLaughlin is by 1969-70, after experimenting with drugs throughout the 1960s, especially hallucinogenics, his discovery of sort of Eastern philosophy, and then, you know, going under the guru Sri Chinmoy, meant that he became a vegetarian, non-smoking, non-drinking, non-drug-taking musician, and he was focused. We have John McLaughlin, highly focused, and we have Larry Coryell, less focused. In the early 1970s, Larry hooked up with a childhood friend called Mike Mandel. Mike Mandel was an incredible keyboard player with all the skills that you would expect from a jazz keyboardist, but he was very, very interested in synthesis. He, in partnership with Mike Mandel, had really found his Jan Hammer. They formed a band called Foreplay, and they made a number of albums in the early 70s. I would point you to Barefoot Boy, Offering, and The Real Great Escape. The first two, Barefoot Boy and Offering, are two of the greatest jazz rock albums ever made. This, at this point, maybe a little too late, you know, as the Mahavishnu Orchestra was emerging. On these albums, he explores this wild improvisational style. Like I said, somewhere between Hendrix and John Coltrane. It's an incredible approach. Listening to the albums, they're wonderful, they're well recorded, the band's incredible, the playing's incredible. It's like a different view of jazz rock fusion, but perhaps the big difference here is the label he was on. These albums were released on the label Flying Dutchman, which was not the same as being on CBS Records like the Mahavishnu Orchestra. He'd got people like Eddie Kramer in, who'd been the engineer for Jimi Hendrix, and they were recorded at Electric Ladyland Studios. These are incredible albums. If you go back to my ranking of the 1970s Larry Coryell albums and watch that video, you will see that I rank these at the highest. But Larry here makes his first mistake in a way, and it's a mistake I'm glad he made, because it produced some great albums. But by 1973, when this wasn't working, he looked around and saw what the Mahavishnu Orchestra was doing, and much like Chick Corea had done with Return to Forever, he decided to form a band in that style. And this was the 11th House. The 11th House made two incredible albums, introducing the 11th House and Level 1. They're masterpieces of jazz rock fusion, but we can see, although the playing's incredible, the use of trumpet. On the first album, we have Randy Brecker on trumpet, replacing the violin, so it has that certain specific sound. Larry Coryell's guitar playing is absolutely incredible. His compositions show an influence of John McLaughlin, but of course, Larry had also been studying composers like Bartok and Stravinsky, and the sort of harmonies that are coming out could have well been there. And I haven't been able to establish whether that sound that you hear, that sort of angular, dark sound that Larry has, whether that came from John McLaughlin or whether it came from his listening to modern classical musicians. But it's there on those first two albums. By the time we get to Aspects, the band lineups change. And with the addition of the Brecker Brothers, it sounds like a Brecker Brothers album. The opening track on Aspects, however, is unbelievable. And it's possibly the 11th House finest moment on record. By the mid-70s, his substance abuse seems to be kicking in. He develops an interest in acoustic guitar playing again and does some incredible albums. There are a couple of live improvised albums that, for me, are like the guitar versions of Keith Jarrett's solo improvisation albums. If he'd have been signed up on ECM Records, again, there might have been a different story here, but he's stuck on different labels. And I think the whole story of Larry Coryell throughout the 1970s is incredible guitar playing, but he's unfocused. The 11th House are unfocused. They never seem to quite find their direction. They never find that thing that makes them different to Return to Forever or Weather Report or the Mahavishnu Orchestra. The album sells relatively well for a jazz group, but not in the same numbers as Return to Forever or Weather Report or the Mahavishnu Orchestra. So the 11th House have always occupied a certain, second division place. I think that's unfortunate. He picked up a lot of solo work throughout the 70s, most notably dueling with Al Di Meola on Lenny White's Venusian Summer, again, one of the greatest fusion albums ever made. Around about this time, Larry offered his opinion about the guitarists that were emerging in his wake. After John McLaughlin emerged, we'd seen guitarists like Bill Connors, we'd seen guitarists like Al Di Meola, Steve Morse, a whole bunch of super fast alternate pickers suddenly emerged onto the scene. This is what Larry said about that. What happened, in my opinion, was that guitar playing just got too fast, and it also got highly competitive. For years I thought, all I want to do is become the #1 rated guitarist in downbeat by the time I'm 30. It was that whole adolescent attitude, placing more importance on the arriving than on the striving. Everything just got too intense. And I think he may have a point there. And some of the work he did, which was much more introverted at this point, may have reflected his feelings at the time. He had a great duo with the Belgian guitarist Philip Catherine. Philip Catherine emerged in the mid-70s as one of the leading European jazz guitarists, eventually landing the gig with Focus, replacing Jan Akkerman. The albums he made with him, the acoustic albums like Twin House, again, are remarkable, and they're ahead of their time. And they seem to be a precursor to the great guitar trio that emerges in the late 70s, early 1980s, with Al Di Meola, John McLaughlin, and Paco de Lucia. Their Friday Night at San Francisco went on to sell millions and millions of copies. But of course, Larry was there first. In the initial forming of that band, he was there before Al Di Meola. The testament to this is the Live at the Royal Albert Hall video, which Larry appears on, playing great, but looking very sweaty, dressed in a suit that looks about 5 years out of date, and with an expression at sometimes where he seems to be quite lost. Maybe he felt he couldn't keep up with John and Paco, but I felt he offered something else. He offered like a melodic, bluesy, almost like rock and roll approach to that trio. Once Al Di Meola came in, I have to be honest, I never preferred it as much as the Larry Coryell lineup, because it was like three completely different personalities. With Al Di Meola on board, it became a basic, machine gun match between John McLaughlin and Al Di Meola, and the jury's out who won. If you pick up the album Castro Marin by Paco de Lucia, you will see some recordings of the trio of Larry, John and Paco. Very interesting lineup. Again, Larry Coryell's there, he's at the birth of it, he's innovating it, but he does not capitalize on it, and he doesn't get the success because of it. Of course, the main reason for him not being the guitarist on the Guitar Trio recordings was his substance abuse. Here's another quote from Larry. By the late 1970s, I had gotten successful. I did some big tours, did some television, People magazine stories, and all that horse shit. I got arrogant. The grandiosity set in, and I forgot how I had gotten there. I had forgotten about the hard work, that struggle. I got lazy, but I would later come to realize that what I had to do was to go back and do all the work again, to practice constantly, to listen to other people's music, study other people's phrasing, work on learning new tunes and old standards, work on horn lines, piano lines, and practice scales. My slogan became GOA, Goya, obviously, after the Spanish painter, but it stood for Get Off Your Ass. I had to work like a madman, especially when I didn't want to work, and it took a lot of humility. It was the beginning of the end of that arrogance. What seems to have lifted him out of his substance abuse was the discovery of Buddhism through two musicians, I think, that came to his rescue. One would be Herbie Hancock and one would be Wayne Shorter. But the fact is, throughout the 1980s, for me, who was listening to jazz rock and I was a Larry Coryell fan, I would go and pick up some of the albums that came out. They usually seemed to be on very small labels, were usually like more standard jazz affairs. And I felt like the excitement and innovation had left him a little bit. One recording, however, that did make a great impression was his acoustic guitar version, I think he did on 12-string actually, of The Rites of Spring that he recorded in 1983 under the ears and eyes of Tio Macero, who had produced Miles Davis before. It's worth mentioning that Larry is also on the legendary and very talked about recordings that Miles Davis made in his hiatus between 1975 and 1980, where Miles went into a studio and nothing came out of those sessions, but I believe Larry was on those as well. I'm sure, Columbia had a lot of hope in these recordings. And again, him turning up on the new Miles Davis album may well have shone a new light on him. Who knows? I always feel with Larry Coryell, this is the story throughout his career. In his personal life, Larry was married to Julie Coryell, who was quite a famous photographer of the jazz rock world in the 1970s, and she and Larry put together the book Jazz Rock Fusion, a book I never owned, but was there was a copy of it actually in Walsall Library, and no, actually it was Wolverhampton Library, and I used to, when I was at college there, go and sit and read that book and learn about these people. So that book was very important to me. After leaving Julie Coryell, he then hooked up with Tracy Coryell and stayed with her until his death in 2017. But I would hazard a guess that after 1980, with the exception of that Rites of Spring album, Larry busied himself. He toured, he recorded, he put albums out, but he never seemed to ever get back, for me, what he had in the 1970s. When I interviewed Martin Taylor, he said one of the most incredible jazz guitarists he'd ever seen was Larry Coryell. He said Larry would take risks on the instrument that no one else would. If you saw him on a good night, he was the greatest guitarist in the world. But if you saw him on a bad night, he wasn't. And I think that sums up his brilliance and his downfall. This was a wild and crazy guy musically and artistically. He was interested in pushing the envelope. He was interested in pushing forward and innovating. And at a certain time in the 1960s, that's what the world wanted. By the time he got to 1980, without that sort of deep legacy that people like John McLaughlin had and Chick Corea, he wasn't able to forge a similar career. The deals weren't there. This, I think, does not represent him as a player. When I sit down and listen to Larry Coryell, what I hear is a guitarist with incredible technique, with an alto picking style, but yes, wasn't in the same league as an Al Di Meola or John McLaughlin, but with a greater jazz knowledge, perhaps, with a greater ability to phrase within the jazz milieu. And his phrasing is absolutely incredible. And he can be the Hendrix. He can play beautiful acoustic guitar. He can be very melodic. He can do all sorts of strange things where you wonder where he's going. He always is laying it on the line. He was always pushing the envelope in terms of being on the edge, not trying to play perfect, but trying to reach for something. I never saw him live, but my friend did, and I remember he came back to the gig and I said, what was it like? And he said, well, I didn't think he was playing really good, but even though he wasn't playing really good, he seemed like he was really enjoying it. He loved to play. I'm happy that in 1981 he kicked the substances. I'm happy that he was able to do that. And I think it's a shame that he's no longer around. If he was around with us today, he'd be 82. But he died in 2017. He was in New York. It was February the 19th. He'd just done a gig, played to an audience. It was at the Iridium Jazz Club in Manhattan, where he'd gone, right back in the early days. He was back on home ground. And he went to his hotel room, went to bed, and died of heart failure. An incredible player. And here we have a brief history of Larry Coryell. I have wanted to cover him more than I have on this channel. And so I am going to endeavour to try and do these biographies where I've got some bullet points here of the life, but also I can bring in my opinion on the musician and throw in a few photographs, and maybe if YouTube will allow a few audio examples, you never know. But I hope you appreciate this. If you did, stick a like on it, subscribe, because I do more of what you like. And if you want to become a member at my Patreon, you can. Or if you want to become a member here on YouTube, you can. And if you want to put some money in my PayPal tip jar, you can. And at the end of this, you'll see a little video which will feature another release I've done on CD over at the incredible website Elastistage. So if you want to support me and get an actual album by me, then I would appreciate it if you nipped over there and purchased that. But you don't have to. You can do whatever you want, because at the moment it's still a free country. Thank you for watching.